I'm John Krosnick of the conference this year. I welcome you all, and I'm absolutely delighted to see so many of you here for this exciting conference. We have some business announcements to make before we begin the afternoon proceedings. And let me just say one thing. I hope you'll all listen carefully to this. We will have a series of other meals in this tent throughout the conference. We noticed coming into this meal that people felt obligated to come through the little walkway on that side by the hotel. There is no reason for you to do that. You can come around the tent and enter from all sides to take a seat wherever you like, so we welcome you to do that in the future. Let me introduce to you certainly the hardest working person who has put this conference together with a large team of other hard-working people. I hope you will express our collective thanks to him. This is Shap Wolf.
Thank you, John. I have a few business announcements to make. The posters are in 2 rooms, as I hope you saw, and we've got some great posters, and we've arranged to be able to leave them up for the afternoon sessions, so you can go back in after lunch and at the breaks, and if the poster presenters would please take them down at the end of the day. We have a wonderful book exhibit that Patricia Moy has put together for us. It is in the Belmont room, which is at one side of our exhibits. Please take time to go in there. The job books are also in a table right inside the Belmont room. We have added a coffee and soda break this afternoon at the break between the afternoon sessions at 3:30 in the exhibit area. I hope you'll take time to have some refreshments there and visit our exhibitors and thank them for supporting AAPOR. We know there's a banging door in one of the meeting rooms, Salon F, that's been bothering you. The hotel is fixing that for us. People who took short courses, your certificates are ready at the registration desk, and the Bob Groves books have come in if you did not get one. Tomorrow morning we have the annual Fun Run Walk. You are to meet in the driveway here at 6:45. There's a shuttle coming over from the Marriott at 6:30, and the Fun Run Walk starts at 7 o'clock in the morning. This evening, after the plenary session, there's a pub crawl downtown. Linda Dimitropoulos, our social coordinator. Linda, are you here? Stand up. Find Linda throughout the day and let her know if you're coming. Linda, there's in the corner. Yay! Let her know how many so that we can arrange transportation, or tell us at the registration desk. That's all, and let's welcome John back and thank him for putting together such an excellent program for us.
Thank you. It's my pleasure to be able to introduce our lunchtime plenary speaker to you today. The lunchtime plenary is made possible through a program called the Decade of Behavior. If you have your binoculars and look closely at the front of the podium, you will see the official Decade of Behavior sign. The Decade of Behavior is an initiative to highlight attention on how research in the behavioral and social sciences can and does address many of our nation's ongoing challenges. Through a focus on 5 broad themes: education, safety, health, prosperity, and democracy, the Decade of Behavior serves as a catalyst for activities directed toward the public, policymakers, and scientists. Nearly 70 professional associations, including AAPOR, are co-sponsors of the Decade of Behavior initiative. Today's plenary lecture is part of the Decade of Behavior Distinguished Lecture Program. The Distinguished Lecture Program sponsors scholars who are outside of an association's direct discipline, but whose work is important to answering the same questions asked in that discipline. The goal of the program is to stretch disciplinary boundaries and underscore how addressing societal problems requires multidisciplinary problem solving and expertise. If you're interested in more information about the Decade of Behavior program, you can visit them on the web at decadeofbehavior.org. Our lecturer today mostly meets the criteria for the Decade of Behavior program, although I will tell you that he is an AAPOR member, has been for some time, and has published research in Public Opinion Quarterly in the past. Rich Petty is currently Distinguished University Professor at Ohio State University in the Department of Psychology, following a stint as a professor of psychology at the University of Missouri. His PhD is from Ohio State University in social psychology. His BA degree from the University of Virginia was in government and foreign affairs. He has to date published 8 books and over 180 journal articles and chapters. His book titles include Attitudes and Persuasion, Classic and Contemporary Approaches, Perspectives in Cardiovascular Psychophysiology, Social Psychophysiology, a Source Book, and Communication and Persuasion, Central and Peripheral Routes to Attitude Change. Rich has received many awards for his work. He is a fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. He received the Ohio State University Distinguished Scholar Award, the Society for Consumer Psychology's Distinguished Scientist Lecturer Award, the Society for Consumer Psychology's Distinguished Scientific Contribution Award, the Donald T. Fisk Distinguished Lecturership at the University of Chicago, and the Donald T. Campbell Award for Distinguished Scientific Contributions to Social Psychology. Rich has served on a number of major national advisory panels, including the National Academy of Sciences Committee on Implementing Dietary Guidelines to Improve the Health of Americans, the National Institute on Drug Abuse panel on using persuasive communication to prevent drug abuse, and the National Science Foundation panel on the human dimensions of global change. It is with great pleasure that I hope you will join me in welcoming to the podium Rich Petty.
Thank you, John, very much for that very nice introduction, and I'm very delighted to be here. As John mentions, although I've been a member of AAPOR for a long time, this is actually my first conference, so this is a great way to be introduced to all of you. The topic of my talk today is the psychology of opinion formation and change, and I'm going to focus on some of the research we've done over the past 20 years or so, looking at how individual differences are important in this regard. This work, of course, it hasn't been done by myself, but with many collaborators who are acknowledged here. And yeah, I actually think you can see those. That's great. I've studied attitudes and persuasion for the past 20 years, where attitudes, we talk about changing or how people form their general evaluations of things. As I stand up here, I realize this is probably the only group in the entire world. I don't have to explain what attitudes and opinions are. But for the 3 of you out there who may not be familiar with this, this deals with topics such as, in the area of politics, was the war with Iraq good or bad? In the area of health, you might ask, is the new smallpox vaccine beneficial or harmful? In business, you might ask, is your perception of vanilla Coke favorable or unfavorable? And in academics, you might ask, is it worthwhile or worthless to listen to a talk in a big, hot, white tent? You get to decide. In terms of understanding evaluation, there are 2 critical issues that we've explored in our research. One issue has to do with, when do people evaluate? That is, do they engage in an evaluation at the time they get the information? So as you're listening to this talk today, are you forming opinions about it while you listen to it? It's a good talk, it's a terrible talk, whatever. Or are you waiting until after all the information is received and then forming an evaluation only when you have to? So in the area of politics, are you thinking about the electoral material as the candidates debate, forming your opinion early on, or do you wait and decide later when you get closer to the vote? Second issue that we'll deal with today is, how do people evaluate? So assume that everybody evaluates at some point, either at the time you're getting information or some later point in time when you need to buy a product. But how is that evaluation formed? And in particular, we'll focus on basically 2 ways in which people can form opinions: by thinking very carefully about all of the information that they get, or by using more simplistic strategies. Okay, well, first let's look at the question of whether or not everybody evaluates, and what psychologists have to say about this. In the Handbook of Social Psychology, which is the Bible of social psychologists, we have two very famous social psychologists, Hazel Marcus and Bob Zients, writing this. Strictly speaking, nearly all cognition and perception is evaluative. It is not possible to view a social object or a social act without, at the same time, making an assessment on dimensions closely corresponding to good, bad, pleasant, unpleasant. And if you look at what social psychologists have to say about this, especially recently, you'll see there's widespread agreement about the pervasiveness of evaluative responding. So if that's true, what does it mean when someone says they have no opinion about something? What could this possibly indicate? Well, a long time ago, Converse told us that one reason people might say they have no opinion is that they're just ignorant of the topic. They just don't have any knowledge. They don't know anything about it. Of course, if they knew something about it, they, of course, would form an opinion about it. So it's absence of knowledge or ignorance that sometimes lead to no opinion responses. But more recently, a second reason has been examined by, among other people, my colleague John Krosnick. He says, well, maybe people are just lazy. And it takes work to retrieve an opinion. You have to think about the issue. You have to understand the question. You have to do a lot of cognitive work. And so someone might just say no opinion because that's an easy thing to do. And there's certainly plenty of evidence that those are two reasons why people might express no opinion. But are there some other possibilities? One I'd like to consider today is this. And as an example, take a look at this transcript from an opinion survey. This was nicely provided by Doug Maynard, who was studying refusals and response rates. So what they were doing in this research was coding a bunch of transcripts, trying to give and understand why people said no. This is the phone call. Subject, hello, interviewer. This is Greg, calling from the University of Wisconsin, calling as part of our National Public Opinion Survey. Subject, I'm not interested. Interviewer, okay, well, it's awfully important that we get the opinions of everyone in the sample. Otherwise, the results won't be very useful. Subject, well, I don't want to give you any of my opinions. I think that the survey is important because the questions are ones that people in universities want answers to. Interviewer, so would you? Oh, I don't have any opinions to give you, so I don't want to answer any of your questions. So this person's really protesting. They just don't have any opinions to give. Interviewer, well, if you don't have an opinion about something, we can skip it, or put down that you don't have an opinion. Subject, I don't mean to be rude about it, but I don't have any opinions. That's just the way I am. Interviewer, is it okay to call you back another time? Well, this person probably isn't going to have any opinions when they're called back the second time either. And so what this transcript suggests is, or makes you wonder, is the person just ignorant about things, or are they just too lazy? Or is it possible that there actually are people out there who don't evaluate very frequently? So that's what a colleague, Blair Jarvis, and I set out to do, to see if we could capture an individual difference in the propensity to evaluate. So we developed this scale that has items on it like this. I want to know what is good and bad about everything. I like to have strong opinions, even when I'm not involved personally. I am pretty much indifferent to many important things. I only form strong opinions when I have to. And so in an attempt to validate the scale, what we did is we purified the items and did all the psychometric things you're supposed to do, but then went out to see whether or not the scale actually predicts differences, individual differences in evaluative responding. So in one of our early studies, what we did is we gave the scale to a bunch of college undergraduates, and we asked them simply to write a little essay about their day yesterday. Okay, so that's the task. Write about your day yesterday. And here's an example of what was written by somebody low in the need to evaluate. I woke up about 10:30 or so after the dog started barking at the neighbor. Pat called and we talked for a while before I started to study for my 2 tests today. I took a study break and went downstairs to talk to my dad and to get some hot teas with a friend of mine called from Kent. I hadn't talked to her in a while. We got caught up in the latest gossip. She's engaged to Tony. They're getting married. After we hung up, the soaps were on. I finished my note cards, watched The Young and the Restless, and at the same time, during The Bold and the Beautiful, I took my shower. My dad made me a steak. After we ate, I went to Myers. I dropped it off his apartment, then I went to work. After work, I had dinner, and while I was cleaning, I studied, then we went to bed. Okay, it's literally a laundry list, practically, of every single event that happened to the person, but what you don't get from this person is any sense of whether or not they liked anything about their day. Was it good? Did they enjoy it? Was it pleasant? Was it unpleasant? All that kind of evaluative stuff that many of us are interested in. Compare that to somebody who scored very high in the need to evaluate scale. What did they write about their day yesterday? Yesterday was a blah day, mainly. In class, I pretty much screwed up a quiz because I couldn't remember the exact terms. I had a take-home quiz due yesterday also, but I'll do well on that one, I know. I was tired all day. Larry and I went to Bob Evans and had a bad waitress, and it took us a long time to eat because we waited so long for our food. But we did have tasty desserts, so it was not too terrible. We went and rented a movie that looked interesting, but neither of us enjoyed it very much. But it was the kind of movie that's so bad that it's sort of amusing. We just hung around, and then I took a bath and relaxed. There wasn't anything really awful that happened, but there really wasn't anything exciting either, so it was just a boring day. But I did get a good night's sleep, and today is going well so far. This person couldn't be more opposite. So here's a person, you don't have any idea of the content of their life, right? What did they eat? What was the movie? All the stuff that was in the earlier person's responses. But you know everything about how they evaluated everything about their day. Everything is encoded and thought about in terms of whether it's good or bad. They liked it or disliked it. So if you wanted to be more scientific about this and you wanted to code their evaluative thoughts in their essays and give them a point for every evaluative thought that they had and not for other thoughts, you'd see that as their need to evaluate scores go up, they engage in more evaluative thoughts, they produce more evaluative thoughts, but as the need to evaluate goes up, there are fewer non-evaluative thoughts. Okay, just to make sure that this effect wasn't exclusively for something that was very personally relevant to them, like their own life, we wanted to see if they would do this more generally to something pretty mundane. So we took a totally different group of undergraduates and we sat them in a room and flashed paintings on the wall before them, and we asked them simply to write some thoughts about the paintings. And what you'll see is that as need to evaluate increased, people tended to write evaluative thoughts. They'd say, "That's really beautiful. I love the beautiful colors," and stuff like that. Whereas in terms of non-evaluative thoughts, what you have is the low need to evaluate people writing a bunch of that stuff. They'd say, "There's a lot of green," and that would be it. But is green good? Is green bad? You don't have any clue. Okay, well, what we're really interested in, of course, is not only what should happen if you're doing a lot of evaluating in your life and you're thinking about everything in evaluative terms. This should mean that you should be the kind of person who forms a lot of opinions about social issues, which is what ultimately we're concerned with. So to examine that, we had undergraduates complete the need to evaluate scale, which has 16 items. We also measured a bunch of other individual differences, at least 4, and measured knowledge because we wanted to make sure that the effects weren't being driven by just absence of information about these topics. The participants responded to 29 items, all of which came from the 1990 National Election Study. So they were on important topics such as environmental protection, legalized abortion, capital punishment, affirmative action, stuff like that. And all of the items, we made sure to include a no opinion option. All the other response options were whatever they happened to be on the National Election Study. And what you can see clearly from this is that, as we expected, as need to evaluate goes up, there are fewer no opinion responses. And so what I want to argue from these data is that, in fact, some of the time when people give no opinions, it's not that they're ignorant. Our low need to evaluate people had just as much knowledge about these topics. They could report beliefs, information, and so forth. They're just not thinking about whether this is a good thing or a bad thing. So they don't really have a ready opinion to give you. And in fact, if that guy from the survey is any indication, it might actually even be unpleasant in some cases to do it. Okay, now, if you're evaluating, we would expect, and what we think happens here is that people form their opinions spontaneously, not forming an opinion instantly at the time that I ask you the question. And so to look at whether or not people formed opinions spontaneously, we had undergraduates complete the need to evaluate scale. And then we gave them some information about something for which they were unfamiliar. These are statements about this hypothetical person, Marie, although they thought the person was real. And what they read was 10 good things about Marie, such as she bought groceries for her elderly neighbor during a storm. and 10 negative things. When she bumped a car in the parking lot, she left without leaving a note. Not a nice thing to do. And all these items were intermixed. The question we were interested in was whether or not people would spontaneously form an evaluation of Marie. And to assess this, we looked at how quickly they gave an opinion about Marie. If you're forming an opinion at the time the information is received, you should be able to give it faster than if you haven't. So that's one criterion. Second, we asked people to remember information about Marie, and both we expect people high and people low in need to evaluate to be able to recall information. But the people who haven't formed an opinion already, when we finally ask them for an opinion, they will be dependent on what they can remember about Marie in order to form that opinion, because they're not doing it until we ask them to. And so they should show a high correlation between the evaluations of what they can remember, how many positive or negative things, and what their attitude is. And so we can see quite nicely with the reaction time data, there's almost a 2-second difference between how quickly people high in their need to evaluate and people low in their need to evaluate reported their opinions. And there's also a nice difference in the attitude recall correlation. So the low need to evaluate people are slower to give their opinions, and they're more reliant on what they can remember because presumably they're not giving an evaluation or forming one until they're asked to. Okay, well, what are some of the implications of this individual difference? First, as need to evaluate increases, as we've seen from some of the laboratory data, people should become more likely to spontaneously form and hold opinions about a variety of topics, of course, including political issues. Second, people who hold political opinions, we think, should be more likely to participate or be involved in politics, be involved in their democracy than those who hold fewer opinions. And why is that? Because you don't know what to do if you don't have an opinion. Who should I give money to? Who should I vote for? How can I engage in any kind of political action if I don't really have opinions about things? I don't know what's good or bad. So we predict people high in the need to evaluate will be more active in their democracy. And that's what we wanted to see. Can need to evaluate predict political behavior above and beyond various other variables that are already used for this, such as how educated people are. Educated people participate more. What their income is. People who have high income participate more, and so forth. Well, it turns out a version of the need to evaluate scale was included in the 2000 national election study, which many of you know, I'm sure, included 1,807 adults in either a face-to-face or telephone interview that took place before the election, and then some of them were followed up in the post-election period also. The need to evaluate items that were included on the scale were developed by my colleague, John Krosnick, who takes full credit or blame for these, but here they are. Some people have opinions about almost everything, other people have opinions about just some things, and still other people have very few opinions. What about you? Would you say you have opinions about almost everything, about many things, about some things, or about very few things? Second item, compared to the average person, do you have fewer opinions about whether things are good or bad, about the same number, or more opinions? So with these two items, we're going to attempt to assess need to evaluate. In a separate study with a bunch of undergraduates, we were able to get both these items as well as the full scale on everybody and see whether or not they were highly correlated, and in fact they are. So these two items are able to capture the essence of the variance in need to evaluate. Okay, so what we wanted to do is to predict political behavior from need to evaluate, which, as I mentioned, was included on the 2000 NES, and see if we could predict variance over and above that accounted for by age and education and gender and income and their interest in politics and their political knowledge and the strength of their party ID and so forth, things like that. Well, obviously I wouldn't be telling you about it if we didn't find something, and so here's some of the things that need to evaluate predicted above and beyond all those other variables like interest and knowledge and income and so forth. First, as might be expected, people high in the need to evaluate reported a greater number of evaluative beliefs about the candidates in terms of the sheer quantity of the evaluative beliefs that we had, and that's exactly what you'd expect based on the laboratory research that I told you about, where they had more evaluative beliefs about themselves and about paintings and so forth. They also have more evaluative beliefs about political things. They also were more likely to experience emotions. Well, if you have an opinion about a candidate, that candidate can disappoint you or they can please you. If you don't have an opinion about the candidate, then it's hard to get emotionally involved either. So we think this is also driven by people's propensity to form opinions. They were more likely to base their preferences on these evaluations of particular positions. And as we expected, they were more likely to engage in political activism. And again, this is a predictor above and beyond their knowledge and interest in that kind of stuff. So they were more likely to wear campaign buttons, to donate money to candidates, and so forth. And we think this is an effect merely of being more likely to have an opinion. They were more likely to follow politics in the media, and they were more likely to report having voted. So on virtually every behavior that we looked at, people high in the need to evaluate were more intensively involved in their democratic system. Okay, so what can we conclude about need to evaluate? People differ in their tendency to spontaneously evaluate. Some people do it frequently, like probably most of us, and others hardly do it at all. The more a person evaluates, the more likely the person is to form and hold opinions about a variety of issues. People who do not chronically evaluate form opinions when needed, based on what they can retrieve from memory. So people low in the need to evaluate still end up voting, though not in as high numbers as people high in the need to evaluate, and they form their opinions later on what they can remember about the campaign, not what came earlier. Being high in the need to evaluate thus predicts a variety of political responses. Okay, so in addition to the big two, you might say, about why people express no opinions, that they just don't have any information, that they're too lazy to engage in this, we believe that people also do not report opinions just because they didn't form them, because they don't enjoy evaluating. Okay, let me turn to the second issue that we've studied, and this is the issue we've studied much more in our research than the first one, but it's the question of how do people evaluate? And there are lots of ways you could slice the pie about how people evaluate. What we've looked at in particular is how much thinking people do when they evaluate, and in particular, do they form opinions with relatively little thought? For example, if it's hot in here, you might say you don't like the talk, but it's really the heat talking. Remember that. It isn't the quality of the talk. Or will you listen to every word that I say and evaluate it and think carefully about the merits of my arguments? That I really present good evidence for the concept of need to evaluate? And advertisers, of course, like others, assume that sometimes we like to do a lot of thinking. Here's an advertisement that you can't read very well from the state of Kentucky, but it gives you tons of reasons to visit the state of Kentucky. They've got shopping and music and all sorts of wonderful things. West Virginia, on the other hand, seems to make a different assumption about our cognitive proclivities and basically go there because you feel good about this ad. There's great food in West Virginia, and this ad would probably really appeal to you if you hadn't just eaten a heavy lunch. Another example, here's an ad with lots of reasons to pick the Vitamix juicer, and you have to go through it and analyze it, and it compares it to everything else. One of my favorite ads, there's Candace Bergen sitting there, looking quite majestic on that horse. And I guess you're supposed to want an American Express card just because she has one, and you like her, right? There's nothing very thoughtful about that, okay? So we make different assumptions. So how do we evaluate? There are two different strategies. You can be very careful and thoughtful in your thinking, and this occurs when you're highly motivated to think and you're able to think and so forth. Or if you're not, you still might change. For example, if you just reason, it's hot in here, so I don't like the talk, or Candace Bergen has one, so I'd like one too. Okay. Now here's an ad that's kind of a hybrid. That's one of my favorites, and that's that it looks like it has lots of information in it, but unlike that Vitamix ad, they're trying to make it easy for you to encode it. So there's a bunch of yeses and a bunch of nos. And so you might come away from this ad thinking that, well, there are just lots of reasons to get a Ford. I don't really have to read all the reasons like you had to do in the Vitamix ad. But if you look more closely at this advertisement, look at the actual arguments. Number 2 up there is free scheduled maintenance, where Ford has it for 2 years and Chrysler has it for 5 years. Okay, so they probably don't want you looking at it all that closely. And look at the one at the bottom, one of my favorites. Cash and coverage available at every Ford dealer. For some unknown reason, you cannot get Ford coverage at Chrysler or at Chrysler dealers. And so that's another reason to go to Ford over Chrysler. So whoever concocted this ad sort of wants the best of... they're probably assuming you're not doing a lot of thinking about the ad, but we like to think that we're thoughtful, right? We like to go with the side that has the most reasons. And so they think maybe that we'll just say there's more reasons for Ford without actually thinking about it, because if you actually thought about it, some of them are pretty silly. But according to the framework I told you, that sometimes people are going to be very thoughtful, and sometimes they're not going to be very thoughtful. And so we wanted to examine that empirically, and so what we did in this study was to manipulate their motivation to think, to see if we can get people forming their opinions thoughtfully as opposed to not thoughtfully. So what we did was we presented undergraduates at Ohio State University with a proposal to raise tuition. And the proposal was either for their own university, Ohio State. So presumably if we're going to raise tuition at Ohio State, you'd want to think about it and see, are we going to get benefits? Are there costs? What's the deal? Or we told them that this was a proposal for a distant university, Oklahoma State University. But the information they're going to get, the reasons are all exactly the same. And so all we're interested in is what they do with this information, when it's something that's very important to them, very highly relevant, or something that's not too relevant. And so to examine how they looked at information, we gave them one of three messages. They either got a message with three very good reasons, what we call the strong arguments to engage in the proposal, or three weak arguments, pretty silly reasons, things like that were in that Ford ad, for example. Or we gave them the mega message with all the arguments, three strong and three weak. And so if all you're doing is counting, because you want to go with the side that has the most reasons, the six arguments message should be the best. But if you're really thinking about the information and integrating it all, then the six argument message really shouldn't be as good necessarily as the three, or it shouldn't be any better, okay, because the weak arguments are kind of silly. Okay, when the proposal was for Ohio State University, that's the high motivation to think people. We manipulate and randomly assign people to these conditions. You can see there's a nice big effect between the three strong arguments and the three weak arguments. And adding three weak arguments to the strong doesn't improve things any. So that's statistically the same as the three strong arguments. And that's sensible if you're being rational. I give you three stupid reasons, it doesn't enhance things. If anything, maybe it detracts a little bit. But what if these very same arguments were given to talk about doing this at Oklahoma State University, where the participants are Ohio State University students? First, the reasons make much less of a difference. Three strong reasons are just a little bit better than three weak reasons, because they're not paying that much attention to the actual reasons. What they're doing, it seems, is just getting this sense of there's lots of reasons. Okay, so this study shows you one of the key points that I want to make, and that's that people can form their opinions in different ways, with a lot of thought or with relatively little thought, and the same messages can be taken in differently with various implications. And so what are the things that we have to be concerned about when people are not doing much thinking? Here, if we want to diagnose a persuasion situation and the issue isn't important or people are very distracted, what we're looking for is the presence of various heuristics. And people will use whatever they can in a heuristic fashion. So they'll count and they'll think more is better. Give more arguments, that's great. Or they might make an inference, well, he must know what he's talking about because John said so, but I don't need to listen to it. So I'll just wait for the conclusion and go along with it because he has expertise. Or various mere association processes that rely on contiguity and so forth would be important. And the importance of knowing what the mechanism is by which the attitude is changed is that we know that attitudes that are changed by these simple processes, mere association, reliance on heuristics, tend to be weak. And by weak, I mean they tend to be not very stable over time. They tend to be easily changed when you get later information. And perhaps most important and interestingly, they're not very directive of our behavior. So I form the opinion, but I'm not really going to act on it. And so that becomes important to know if you're doing a survey and assessing opinions. What presumably we're assuming is that people are going to act on the attitudes that we assess. They're going to vote like they consistent with their evaluations of the candidates, or they're going to buy products consistent with their evaluations of them. Okay. Of course, persuasion can occur. Attitudes can be formed by various thoughtful means. And so when we're concerned about thinking, we want to diagnose the situation in terms of, first, how extensive is the thinking? If a person's thinking, then we're concerned with getting them to generate lots of thoughts that are favorable to the product or the candidate or whatever it is, because we know that the more favorable thoughts people have to the message, not surprisingly at all, the more persuasion that's likely to occur, and the more unfavorable thoughts that we have, the less persuasion. A third factor that we have to be concerned about that I'll talk a little bit about is, do people use the thoughts that they generate? Okay, just because we have a thought, that doesn't mean that we're going to do anything with it. We have thoughts all the time that we just discard and we think are not worth using. And so we need to understand how that process works. And then finally, if you've been very thoughtful and you've generated the thoughts, you're going to rely on your thoughts and use them, then we have attitudes that tend to be strong in the sense that they tend to be more stable over time, they're more resistant to change when attacked, and they're more directive of judgments and behavior. If I've thoughtfully come to my opinion, I'm more likely to act on it. Okay, so let's take these questions very briefly one by one and see what we know about them. First question, how do we know how much thinking a person's going to do? Well, social psychologists and others have come up with quite a long list of variables that determine how much thinking we do. So we saw one example in the first study I presented in this line of research, where when something was personally relevant, people thought about it more than when it was not relevant. But there are other variables that have similar effects. You can be accountable. And so those things that make us motivated to think. On the other hand, we might be really motivated to think, but we're unable to think because we're too distracted, okay? Or it's too complicated, so we need to hear it a few times before we're able to think about it. So motivational and ability variables. What I want to focus on today, however, consistent with the theme, is individual differences. And so the question becomes, are there some people who just chronically tend to think about things more than others? And here the primary thing that we want to separate this from is intelligence, or IQ, or education, and so forth. And so in the early work on this, we were careful to eliminate those effects, assess intelligence, and so forth. So the effects we'll talk about are effects of motivation to think, not these other variables with which it is associated, albeit to a much smaller degree than you might expect. There are plenty of intelligent people who just don't enjoy thinking. They're very smart. They can think, just don't enjoy it. Plenty of unintelligent people who love to think and will spout off all the time. And you probably know some of those somewhere in your life. Okay. As in the work on Need to Evaluate, we developed the scale, which has items such as, I usually end up deliberating about issues even when they do not affect me personally. People respond to these items like they did in the Need to Evaluate scale by marking whether these statements are very characteristic of them, only slightly characteristic, somewhat uncharacteristic, and so forth. Five-point scale is what we usually use. I like to have the responsibility of handling a situation that requires a lot of thinking. I feel relief rather than satisfaction after completing a task that requires a lot of mental effort. Thinking is not my idea of fun. That kind of captures it. Okay, so we have these 18 items that do it. You probably could do it much more simply. Here's an advertisement from the New York Review of Books that I kind of like that attempts to capture this dimension in 2 items. If you look at this, basically you have to pick one of these. Yes, I'm an intellectual and proud of it. No, I don't like to think. And pretty good. Okay, what do we predict about people who are high in their need for cognition? This is the dimension of your propensity to enjoy thinking. Well, you should think more carefully about issue-relevant information. So to examine this, what you would do is a study like this, which I'll describe, where we showed people an advertisement for a new product, and we included either strong or weak arguments in the ad. You remember the study I told you about before? Personal relevance was one of those things. When something was really relevant, we paid more attention to the quality of the information that we got. So the same should be true of this individual difference if it captures that same variance. So the ads had, for this razor, had really good arguments, like it has unsurpassed sharpness and chemical bonding that allows for an incredibly smooth shave, and so arguments like that. There were some others. Or they had arguments like this: it floats in water with a minimum of rust. It can only be used once, but is memorable. These are pretty dramatic differences in arguments, and it turns out we have to make pretty dramatic differences like this sometimes because low need for cognition people just don't really seem to care or notice, as you will see here. So here we've divided people at the median into those high and low in need for cognition. And you can see, really, it's the people who score high on the scale who are showing the big difference for that pretty blatant manipulation. They're considering the actual merits of whatever it is. In this case, it's a mundane thing like a razor, something that has no particular importance to them, right? So we didn't raise the importance of it in any way. They just like to think. You give them something, they think about it, even if it's for this advertisement for this razor. People low in need for cognition don't seem to notice, don't seem to care. Okay, well, if people high in need for cognition think about issue-relevant information, their attitudes should be based on their issue-relevant beliefs. And so we wanted to see whether or not that was true and also take the need for cognition scale out into the quote-unquote real world. So in collaboration with the Energy Department of the City of Columbia, Missouri, we sent to 435 residents a survey that the power company at the time was interested in energy conservation. And so what they wanted to do was to be able to take control of individuals' air conditioners during the summertime and shut them off whenever the power company reached its peak load. Okay, and so what they were soliciting our help with was trying to find out whether people would like this or not. Not surprisingly, on average, people don't like it. You wouldn't. It gets really hot in Columbia, Missouri, in the summertime. But more important, they wanted to know why. And so for their purposes, for our purposes, we measured need for cognition, just 9 of the 18 items, because it was a survey, didn't think we could get everybody to do everything and had a limited amount of space. They rated their attitudes toward the program, but more importantly, what the power company was interested in was which of the particular beliefs drive the attitude, because ultimately they were going to try to engage in a persuasion campaign. They wanted to send out materials to try to convince people to sign up for this program, and so they wanted to know in advance what reservations people would have about the program. So we used a standard expectancy value kind of belief assessment. So, for example, they would rate losing control over their air conditioner. How likely is that? Well, it's a near certainty if you sign up for this program. So if you understand it, you should rate that high likelihood. But the desirability of that might not be so good. There might be, of course, variance in that. Will you help to conserve energy? Well, some people think that was likely, some think it's not so likely, and some think it's a great thing, some think it's not such a great thing. And so we were able to determine which beliefs really drove opinions. But for our purposes today, the important thing is that it's the people high in need for cognition who show this strong relationship between their underlying beliefs and their attitudes. People low in need for cognition still had attitudes about the program, but it wasn't being driven by the substance or merits of the issue. And this was replicated a few years later in a bigger national sample in the Netherlands from a former postdoc of mine who got this into a big phone survey and also showed that there was greater relationship between underlying beliefs and attitudes for people high in need for cognition. Well, if people high in need for cognition think more about issue-relevant information and they have attitudes that are based on their underlying beliefs, they also should be less susceptible to, basing their attitudes on simple heuristic and association processes. And so in this case, what we wanted to do was to vary something about a message. In this case, I'm going to show you an advertisement just because it's visually easier to see. And in this case, it should be something that's really irrelevant to the talk. Like the heat in the room, I'll remind you again, is irrelevant to your evaluation of the merits of the talk, as is the attractiveness of the person in this advertisement for an electronic typewriter, right? Not really relevant. You should be focusing on the merits of the issue. But we wanted to compare this ad with this one. As I look at that one, that kind of looks like my photo as time goes on. But that's the only thing that's different, is the attractiveness of this person, a pretty irrelevant thing for assessing this typewriter. And what we can see, it's the low need for cognition people who are basing their attitudes on that. It's completely irrelevant, doesn't make any logical sense. The high need for cognition people show a small effect, but not statistically different. Okay, so if these people who enjoy thinking are forming their attitudes based on the information that they get, it's based on, they have all this structural information on which to base their attitudes, whereas people low in need for cognition are basing it on the attractiveness and the heat in the room and so forth. The attitudes of people high in need for cognition should be stronger. And so that's the next thing we wanted to examine. And the way you can examine this in the laboratory is you want to first change attitudes to the same degree in people high and low in need for cognition. And the way we do that is we give people messages with very positive cues, like attractive people, but also very strong arguments, right? So you can give exactly the same message to people who are very thoughtful and people who are not very thoughtful. And what should happen is they both should change, but they're changing for different underlying reasons. And because they're changing for different underlying reasons, that has implications for the strength of the attitudes that they form. So in one study, very simple, we just changed attitudes to the same degree in people high and low in need for cognition, and then you measure them 2 weeks later. Lo and behold, the change has lasted for people high in need for cognition, whereas people low in need for cognition became more favorable toward the issue or product, but 2 weeks later, that change is gone. They're back to whatever they had been thinking previously. So the change didn't last. So for people low in need for cognition, you have to keep presenting the message over and over and over and over again. Okay, a second thing is, so that's looking at what happens over time. But this property, the attitude, is visible immediately after it's formed. And so the way you can examine this is by, after changing attitudes towards something, you can then try to attack the position you just made them favorable toward with a contrary message. And the people high in need for cognition, because they have all this wealth of information behind their attitudes, should be able to defend their position better in light of this attacking message than should people who are low in need for cognition. So here's some data from a study where the blue line is the low need for cognition people, and I've just shown you we changed it from baseline to after the first message to be more favorable. You change the people high in need for cognition to exactly the same extent, but again, the underlying basis is presumably different. And then you attack the attitude, and you can see what happens is right after they formed it, they bounce back to whatever it is, as long as you have a reasonable cue involved in the message. The high need for cognition people don't. And then finally, and again, perhaps most importantly, the attitudes that people high and low in need for cognition form are better able to predict their behavior if you're high. So in one study, we conducted a survey right before an election, measured the attitudes of people high and low in need for cognition, phoned them back after the election, asked them for whom they voted, and just simply looked at the correlation between attitudes and votes, and the correlation is considerably higher for people high in need for cognition. So the attitudes of those people have greater utility. So if you're doing a survey and you can assess need for cognition one way or another, and you're ultimately interested in behavior, there may be, again, it's a continuous relationship, but I talk about it in terms of these dichotomous groups for ease. There are some people for whom those attitudes are going to be better predictors than others, and perhaps weighting by this might help to improve behavioral prediction. Okay, what do we know so far? People high in need for cognition think more about issue-relevant information. Thus, they're influenced by its quality. They have attitudes that are based on underlying beliefs. They're less influenced by simple inference and association processes, and they have attitudes that are stronger. So far, it sounds like being a high need for cognition person, being thoughtful in your opinions, is a good thing. You do more careful thinking. You act on what you believe. Isn't this how we all want to be? Well, let's see. Is there any reason to suspect that there might be a downside to this? Well, there are two kinds of biases to which thoughtful people might be more susceptible than non-thoughtful people. And the first bias has to do with the valence of the thoughts. Because all I've told you so far about high need for cognition people is they're going to generate thoughts. Right? They're going to be doing a lot of thoughts. But what's going to determine what those are? Well, if you give people clearly strong arguments or weak arguments, yeah, that's going to determine the valence of their thoughts, and it's going to look like they're completely rational. But we know from other work in social psychology that there are various things in the environment that can bias the thoughts when you're generating them. So let's take an example of mood effects. We know that when people are feeling good, they rate the economy is better than when they're not feeling good. In the study by Forgas, he assessed people's opinions about the economy after they came out of a happy movie or a sad movie. Lo and behold, when they came out of the happy movie, the economy was great. When they came out of a sad movie, the economy wasn't that great. Norb Schwartz and his colleagues have done studies similar to this. When the weather is good, people rate their life satisfaction as higher than when the weather is poor. But what's responsible for this? Well, the most common explanation is that mood is a simple cue. I use this example myself. It's hot in here, so you're not going to like my talk. It doesn't really require an effortful process to do that. And if that's what's happening, these effects should work mostly for those low in need for cognition. But we also know from other work in cognitive psychology that when we're in a really good mood, there's a spreading activation to other good things stored in memory. And so if you're really thinking, trying to generate and retrieve information, what's going to happen if you're in a good mood and you're trying to think is you're more likely to think positive things or retrieve positive things. And so this is a very thoughtful way in which the same bias can occur. And if that's the mechanism behind the bias, it should work better for those high in need for cognition. Well, we don't actually have to choose which of these is the mechanism because both of these are true, but they're going to be true for different people. Different people, different mechanisms of the bias. And that's what we wanted to show in this study. So we had a bunch of undergraduates put in a positive or a neutral mood to vary that. They then got a persuasive message, and we took our various measures, and we separated them into those high and low in need for cognition. And this is the high need for cognition group. You can see the more positive they felt when they were in the positive mood group, the more positive their thoughts were. So mood is having a biasing impact on what they think. The more positive their thoughts were, of course, the more positive their attitude. There's no direct effect. For people low in need for cognition, it's just the opposite. Mood is not biasing their thoughts. They're just making this simple inference, I feel good, so I'll go along with whatever it is. So on the surface, if you just looked at the attitude measure, it would look like the biasing effect was identical. When you look at the mechanism, you see the effect is quite different. It occurs for different reasons for these different groups of people. And that's important because the highly thoughtful people are the ones who are more likely to act on this attitude that's been formed through this irrelevant bias, right? Low need for cognition people, they have this bias. It's not going to last very long, not going to have a big impact on their behavior. So in this case, it's the thoughtful people who are in most jeopardy. So if you're hot here and you're high in need for cognition, it's going to bias the thoughts you have about my talk, which is unfortunate because you're going to walk out of here and tell everybody about it. You're going to be really resistant to change later and so forth. Okay, so we've seen that that's one kind of bias. We call that a valence bias. And there are a number of variables that can induce this valence bias, like affect or mood is one thing. But anything that happens to be activated in memory, either consciously or subconsciously, can have the same effect for people who are high in need for cognition. There's one other kind of bias that people are susceptible to, and that's which of the thoughts generated influence your attitudes. Now, this is a bias that's particularly likely for thoughtful people because for non-thoughtful people, they're not even having very many thoughts. So who cares about what they think about their thoughts, right? They don't have any. But if you're the kind of person who has thoughts, you're likely also the kind of person who cares about your thoughts. And the problem is that there are a number of variables that can determine how confident we feel in whatever it is that we have generated or thought about. What is the thought confidence effect? And this is just one example of a use bias. Others would be if the thoughts are accessible, you're more likely to use them than if they're non-accessible. But there are a whole variety of variables that fall under this. I'll talk about this one. So the idea basically, again, is after you've generated a thought, do you think about the validity of the thought? And if you think your thought is great, then you're going to go forward and form your attitude based on it. And if you think your thought's not so great or you have some reason to doubt it, then you won't use it. Okay, the more confidence you have in your thoughts, the more your thoughts should determine your attitude. So now we're holding constant, people had thoughts. Right? So we're only talking about the people who've had a lot of thoughts. And so this is a separate predictor. You had 5 thoughts, I had 5 thoughts. If I have a lot of confidence in my thoughts, I'll be more favorable than you if I had 5 favorable thoughts and you did too. So increasing confidence in favorable thoughts increases persuasion, but increasing confidence in unfavorable thoughts reduces it. Just an example of a recent study we did to examine this. We had people generate positive or negative traits about themselves. So these are undergraduates at Ohio State University who are asked to think of first and then write down 3 positive traits that they will bring to the job market or 3 negative traits that they thought they possessed that they would bring to the job market. So everybody generates the trait first. So they've got it. Then what we did to vary confidence is we had them write the trait with either their right hand, which is their dominant hand for the subjects in our sample, they were all right-handed, or their left hand. The cover story was were predicting career choices from graphology. So they list the thought with the right hand or the left hand. And we assessed how much confidence they had in the traits that they listed, as well as their self-esteem. Okay? If you use your traits and you think about positive traits, you should have higher self-esteem than if you list a bunch of negative traits about yourself. Okay, and the hypothesis is that if you write these with your right hand, your dominant hand, you'll have confidence in whatever you wrote. It's easy to do, looks good. Sometimes I am lazy, must be true. Okay? On the other hand, if you write something with your left hand, I am smart, oh no, there's doubt. You can see the doubt right there in the handwriting. Right? Now, of course, the subjects aren't presumably aware that that's where the doubt is coming from, but if these extraneous sources of doubt can influence whether we use our thoughts or not, there should be a corresponding effect on their self-esteem. And so you can see when they wrote positive thoughts, they had higher self-esteem when assessed if they wrote the thoughts with their right hand than their left hand. But when they wrote negative traits, it's just the opposite. Or looked at differently, when you had confidence in what you generated because you wrote with the right hand, you were more influenced than when you wrote them with the left hand. And mediation of this effect is totally through trait confidence. Okay? When you wrote with your right hand, you had confidence in what you wrote. When you had confidence in what you wrote, you relied on it in your self-esteem. And so I'm going to skip over this next study. But basically what this study shows is that people who are high in their need for cognition are particularly susceptible to these kinds of confidence effects. What we did in this particular study is we had people listen to a persuasive message while they were nodding their heads up and down in a vertical fashion or shaking them side to side in a horizontal fashion. The idea behind this is the purpose of head nodding really is of social significance. What head nodding does is convey social validation to someone else. So you're nodding when you're going along with me. And so if you were nodding while I was speaking, I would gain confidence in what I was saying. If you were shaking your heads, I would lose confidence in what I was saying. So the idea here is that perhaps the same mechanism can work if I'm nodding my head myself. It's not a social signal, but what the meaning is confidence. That if I'm nodding my head while I'm thinking positive thoughts, I really like those positive thoughts. I have confidence in them. And so when I got strong arguments to which I generated positive thoughts, when I was nodding my head yes, you can see here on the graph, I was more persuaded than when I was nodding no. What's interesting is just the opposite takes place when I got weak arguments to which I was generating mostly unfavorable thoughts. Here, because my thoughts were unfavorable, when I'm nodding yes, I'm gaining confidence in these negative thoughts, and so I use them more, and so I'm less influenced. Okay? And this only occurs for people high in need for cognition, no effect for people low in need for cognition. And again, this head nodding effect is completely mediated by the confidence in what people have in their thoughts. So we've seen a bunch of good things about people high in need for cognition. They think more about information. They have attitudes based on beliefs. They're less influenced by simple inferences. They have stronger attitudes. But there also is a downside. They have thoughts that can be influenced by extraneous situational factors, such as their mood. And thoughtful people are more concerned about whether or not they'll use their thoughts or not. And so they're more susceptible to things like whether they're nodding their heads, whether they wrote with their right hand or their left hand, how easy the thought was to come to mind. And so high need for cognition people are more susceptible to ease of retrieval effects. What are some of the implications of this? We'll go through quickly. So answering a survey, as we know, can be cognitively effortful. And so some survey effects will be due to this. And we saw one example of this, some of the work that John and some others have done, showing that people low in need for cognition are more likely to say no opinion on a questionnaire. And that's because they're too cognitively lazy to do the work that it takes to retrieve the opinion. A different reason than why low need to evaluate people didn't do it. They didn't do it because they didn't have an opinion, not that they were too lazy. Low need to cognition people have opinions, they just don't want to retrieve them. Okay, there are various low effort biases that might be found in surveys, such as going along with the presumed opinions of an attractive interviewer, more likely for people low in need for cognition. And third implication is the one I've probably highlighted more than the others, and that's that whatever opinions you assess are not going to be as useful in determining how that person will behave. But there are some issues we have to be concerned about for people high in need for cognition. These individuals are more influenced by various high-effort biases. And so it's useful to divide the biases and think about, do they result from a low-effort process, or do they result from a highly cognitively effortful process, in which case the high need for cognition people will do it. And so one example is the valence bias that we talked about, but a second example is the use bias, that high need for cognition people will be more susceptible to things that vary the confidence they have in the thoughts that they have when they're attempting to respond to a survey item. What features of a survey could affect the confidence you have in your responses? Remember, I gave you an example of some research from our lab that varied whether or not people responded to a question with their right hand or their left hand. Okay? Well, in a variation of this, Nick Epley and his students looked at whether or not asking the question in a confident or non-confident way could affect responses. So what they did in a recent paper presented at this year's Society for Personality and Social Psychology conference, they had students answer 15 general knowledge questions, and the questions were printed in a standard font like this: who was the leader of the Argonauts, or in a degraded font like that. These are the actual materials from their study. You can read it, and all the subjects could read it, but it's a little hard, right? So you have the sense of difficulty that's coming from the question, of course, and everyone showed the same correctness in the responses. So the easy or difficult font isn't affecting the correctness of the answer, but when I asked them how confident they were in their answers, there's a good size effect for whether or not they're confident. How likely is it that it's true, going from 20 to over 40% likelihood that the answer is true. So individuals high in need for cognition should be more susceptible to these shaky question effects, or tentative interviewers, or other cues to lack of confidence, because they're the only ones who care about what they think. And so it takes a second step to think about how confident am I in my response. Okay, I'm going to end in 2 minutes for those of you keeping tabs. We've learned now some things about two different individual difference variables, the need to evaluate and the need for cognition. And some of you may be wondering, they sort of sound similar, right? They're both about needing something anyway. But it's only interesting if they're really separate. And so I've so far talked about each of them separately and showed you what they could do consistent with the kind of construct that it is. But what we really want to know is, do these variables account for independent variance in observed effects? And second, do they ever predict different things? So when they predict the same thing, do they account for separate variance? And are they capable of relating to different things? So to do that, you need to include them both in the same study. And I'll give you one example from some work we've done on opinion formation. You recall that people low in the need to evaluate are more likely to report having no opinion on a survey. That's the research I began with. And that's because people low in the need to evaluate are less likely to have opinions. They're not evaluating. People low in need for cognition are also more likely to report having no opinion on a survey. But we think the underlying reason for this is different. This is because people low in need for cognition are less likely to engage in the cognitive work of retrieving an opinion that they have, or perhaps constructing one on the spot if that's what's required. So what we did in one study, just to see if we could get separate variance for them, is we had students complete both measures. Then they responded to 32 real issues, like on capital punishment, affirmative action, prayer, and school. We also had them respond to 2 fake issues, and I'll tell you why in a second. These were the Agricultural Trade Act and the Monetary Control Bill, issues about which people had really no information. What do we expect on the real issues? We expect both need to evaluate and need for cognition to show similar effects. They both should report no opinion more often. The effect should be independent of each other, and that's what you can see in this case. This is the number of no opinions reported. And so if you look at the red bar versus the blue bar, in each case, that's the need for cognition effect. For both low and high need to evaluate individuals, there's an effect of need for cognition. But if you compare across, you can see that at both levels of need for cognition, there's also a need to evaluate effect. That when you're low in need to evaluate, you express more no opinion. So there's no interaction, they're just two main effects, they're independent sources of variance. What about the bogus issues? Here we think there is a reason to suspect there'd be difference. We think people low in need for cognition, but not those low in need to evaluate, should report fewer opinions on the bogus items. And this is because the effect for need to evaluate is due to retrieval. There should be no difference on bogus issues because nobody has any real opinions here anyway, right? But on the bogus issues, you can construct an opinion if you think about it carefully, right? You know a little something about monetary control or agricultural trade, and you can kind of fill in stuff and make up an opinion. And that's, in fact, what happens. The people high in need for cognition are making up opinions on these issues. And so people high in need for cognition are expressing more opinions on the two issues, on average, almost 1 out of 2 of them, whereas there's no effect whatsoever for need to evaluate. So here's a case of where they're predicting something quite different. Okay, so it's a 2x2 world, if you wanted to be simplistic about it. Social psychologists love 2x2s. And let's consider the impact of both of these variables together in my concluding overhead. We've got people who are not thinking and they're not evaluating. They're still alive and they're out there, but they're doing neither of those things very frequently. So we'd expect these people to have just, this is that guy that was in the survey. He just doesn't have any opinions about anything and doesn't even want to think about constructing one. He could, that's where he is. But you could be low in the need to evaluate, but high in the need for cognition. So you'd be a kind of person who doesn't have opinions to retrieve because you're not spontaneously forming opinions. But if you ask me for my opinion, I can construct one quite easily by doing some thought. If that's the task, I'll do it. So they're the ones we think who are especially susceptible to that bogus issue effect. If you ask for an opinion, they're going to think about it, come up with something, and so forth. You could also be low in the need for cognition, but high in the need to evaluate. Because you're high in the need to evaluate, you'll have lots of opinions, but they won't be formed very carefully, and so those opinions will be very weak. And then finally, we have people who do both. They'll have many opinions, but those opinions are quite strong and predictive of their behavior. And that's all I wanted to tell you today. Thank you very much for your attention.